Jan Hus. Let me take you back to the early 1400s, an age when questioning the church could cost you more than faith. Jan Hus was a humble Czech priest from the University of Prague who dared to say what most only whispered, that the church should live by scripture, not by wealth and power. Influenced by the English reformer John Wycliffe, Hus preached in the Czech language, calling out corruption, the sale of indulgences, and bishops who served gold before God. His sermons drew thousands. Prague's Bethlehem Chapel became a spiritual volcano, and that frightened Rome. In 1411, the Pope excommunicated Hus. By 1414, he was summoned to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct from Emperor Sigismund. That promise was broken. He was arrested, chained, and accused of heresy. For months they pressed him to recant. Hus refused, saying, "I would not for a chapel of gold retreat from the truth." On July 6, 1415, they stripped him of his priest's robes and burned him alive. Witnesses said he sang hymns as the flames rose. But death didn't silence him. It ignited a movement. His followers, the Hussites, fought crusades for 20 years, forcing Europe to take them seriously. A century later, Martin Luther called Hus a prophet of reform. So even though the church turned him to ashes, his words outlived the fire, and those ashes became the first sparks of the Protestant Reformation.
Joan of Arc. Picture France in the early 1400s, war-torn, half-conquered by England, and losing hope. Into that chaos stepped a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy, Joan of Arc, who said she heard divine voices telling her to save her country. She couldn't read or write, but her conviction moved kings and soldiers alike. In 1429, wearing armor and carrying a banner, she led French forces to victory at Orléans, the battle that flipped the 100 Years' War. Her presence alone rallied men who thought defeat was destiny. Within months, the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII in Reims, just as Joan had promised. But politics is colder than faith. Captured by Burgundian allies of England in 1430, she was sold to her enemies and put on trial in Rouen by church authorities loyal to English power. The charges mixed heresy, witchcraft, and even the sin of cutting her hair short to wear armor. Over 12 weeks of interrogation, nearly 70 sessions, she stood alone, 19 years old, refusing to confess to lies. On May 30th, 1431, they tied her to a stake in the marketplace. She begged only for a cross to hold. As fire climbed around her, witnesses said she called Christ's name until her voice vanished in smoke. 25 years later, the same church that burned her cleared her name. In 1920, she was declared a saint. What burned that day wasn't a witch. It was fear of courage itself. Joan died young, but her legacy still proves that conviction, once lit, is harder to extinguish than any flame.
Charles I of England. Imagine being a king who truly believes his power comes straight from God, and then watching your own people put you on trial. That was Charles I. Born in 1600, he inherited 3 kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, and a belief so unshakable in his divine right to rule that compromise felt like weakness. But Parliament saw things differently. For years, Charles fought with them over money, taxes, and religion. He dissolved Parliament 3 times, raised funds without approval, and married a Catholic queen, which worried a mostly Protestant nation. When his royal army clashed with Parliament's forces in 1642, the English Civil War began. It tore the country apart. About 200,000 people died, nearly 4% of the population. By 1649, Parliament's new model army, led by Oliver Cromwell, had won. Charles was captured, accused of tyranny and treason, crimes unheard of for a sitting monarch. The court declared him guilty, calling him a man of blood. On January 30th, 1649, he stepped onto a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace. In front of silent crowds, he forgave his enemies, said he died a faithful man, and signaled the axe himself.
One stroke ended 6 centuries of unquestioned royal power. His death shook Europe. No king had ever been executed by his own people in a public trial. England became a republic for 11 years under Cromwell before the monarchy returned. But nothing was the same. Charles's beheading proved a crown could fall to law, not just to rebellion. It was the day the idea of absolute monarchy truly died.
Peter Stuyvesant's slave execution. Let's rewind to New Amsterdam, today's New York City, when it was a rough Dutch outpost of traders, sailors, and enslaved Africans. Peter Stuyvesant, the colony's last Dutch governor, ruled with an iron hand. In the 1660s, when 2 enslaved men were accused of killing their overseer, that iron hand turned into a fist of terror. The trial was swift, the verdict already written. One man was sentenced to be hanged by the ribs, a hook driven through his side, his body left to rot for days. The other was burned alive. It wasn't just punishment, it was a message. Officials wanted every enslaved person along the harbor to watch, to feel the heat of what colonial power could do to a black body that defied it. Stuyvesant called it justice. In truth, it was public control through fear, an imported European ritual of pain reshaped into the foundation of racial slavery in the Americas. This single spectacle fused law and brutality, turning violence into policy. When the English took the colony in 1664 and renamed it New York, they kept most of those slave codes intact. The fire that burned beneath Stuyvesant's gallows didn't die. It spread through centuries of American slavery and racial injustice. That's why this forgotten execution matters. It shows how early justice learned to enforce skin color instead of law.
Blackjack Ketchum. Picture the last days of the Wild West. Dust, trains, and outlaws riding into legend. One of them was Thomas Blackjack Ketchum, a Texas cowboy turned train robber whose gang terrorized the Southwest in the 1890s. He wasn't the worst killer or thief, but he became a symbol of chaos the new century wanted to leave behind. In 1899, Ketchum tried to rob a train alone near Folsom, New Mexico territory. A conductor shot him, the gang scattered, and he was captured bleeding and half delirious. Because the territory was desperate to make an example, he was charged not with murder, but with felonious assault upon a train. The law had recently made that a capital crime, even though no one died. On April 26, 1901, crowds filled Clayton to watch the hanging, the territory's first in years. But the rope was new, the drop miscalculated. When the trapdoor opened, the force was too great. The rope snapped his neck clean off, sending his head rolling at the sheriff's feet while the crowd gasped. The newspapers called it justice served with a grim smile. The public called it barbaric. Ketchum's death became the last known legal hanging in New Mexico territory. His severed head legend outlived his crimes, and his story marked the moment when frontier justice showed its cruelty nakedly to the world. A final violent echo of an age trying and failing to civilize itself.
Nathan Hale. In 1776, the American Revolution was still fragile. Washington's army was exhausted, New York was burning, and intelligence was vital. That's when a young Connecticut schoolteacher, Captain Nathan Hale, volunteered to sneak behind British lines. He was only 21. Disguised as a Dutch schoolmaster, Hale gathered troop movements on Long Island, but within a week he was caught with maps and notes hidden in his boots. General William Howe ordered his execution without trial. On September 22, 1776, at dawn in Manhattan, Hale faced the gallows alone before a crowd of redcoats. Witnesses say his voice did not tremble as he declared, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." No spy in that war won victory from his information, but his death won something greater, an idea of honor and sacrifice larger than the revolution itself. Hale became America's first folk hero of patriotism, proof that sometimes a single life lost can ignite a nation's belief that its freedom is worth any price.
José Rizal, in the late 1800s, Spain still ruled the Philippines, a colony restless for dignity. José Rizal, a doctor, novelist, and reformer, chose to fight not with guns, but with words. His books, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, exposed the cruelty of colonial priests and politicians. They spread like wildfire across the archipelago, planting the idea of a free Filipino identity. The Spanish authorities saw his ideas as rebellion. Though he never led a battle and condemned violence, he was arrested for sedition and treason. At dawn on December 30th, 1896, in Manila's Bagumbayan field, 8 Filipino riflemen faced him as a squad of Spanish soldiers stood ready behind. Rizal refused a blindfold, turned to face the sun, and fell with his eyes open. Within days, uprisings erupted nationwide. His death united a people who had been divided by class and region. Rizal became the martyr who proved the power of ideas over empires, the man whose execution transformed a colony into a nation in the making.
Mata Hari. She called herself Mata Hari, the Eye of the Dawn, an exotic dancer from the Netherlands who entranced pre-war Europe with silks, mystery, and stories of temples in Java. When World War I erupted, her charm became her wreckage. Both French and German officers used her connections to feed or gather intelligence. By 1917, France, battered by defeats and desperate for scapegoats, decided she was the enemy. Accused of passing military secrets to Germany, Mata Hari was tried in closed court with no hard evidence. Her fame made her an easy target, an outsider, sexually liberated, and foreign. On October 15, 1917, she was led before a French firing squad outside Paris. She refused a blindfold, looked the soldiers in the eyes, and did not flinch as the guns fired. For decades, she was painted as a seductress and traitor. Only later did declassified records show she was more pawn than spy. In death, Mata Hari became a symbol of how wartime fear can turn a woman's image into a weapon and truth into the first casualty.
Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were Italian immigrants, poor shoemakers, and self-taught anarchists in an America gripped by the Red Scare. In 1920, a payroll robbery in Massachusetts left 2 men dead. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested with handguns but flimsy links to the crime. What sealed their fate wasn't evidence, it was prejudice. A judge called them those anarchists, and newspapers fanned the fear of foreign radicals. For 7 years, they fought through appeals as global protests erupted from Paris to Buenos Aires. Intellectuals, Einstein, H.G. Wells, and others pleaded for mercy. Nothing changed. On August 23, 1927, they were strapped into the electric chair in Charlestown Prison. Sacco shouted "Viva Anarchia" before the switch was thrown. Their execution became a warning that justice can bend under fear. In 1977, Massachusetts governor issued a proclamation clearing their names, half a century too late. Sacco and Vanzetti had died as outsiders, but their fight left a legacy written in lightning, that fair trials are fragile when a nation is afraid.
John Brown. By the late 1850s, America was ready to split. Slavery was tearing it apart, and John Brown, a fiery abolitionist from Connecticut, believed words were no longer enough. He'd already fought violently in Bleeding, Kansas. Then, in October 1859, he struck at the heart of slavery itself. With 21 men, including 5 black followers, Brown raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, aiming to spark a nationwide slave uprising. The rebellion never caught. Within 36 hours, U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee stormed the armory. 10 of Brown's men were killed. Brown was wounded and captured. His trial was swift. Charged with murder, treason, and conspiring with enslaved people, he faced his fate unflinching. On December 2, 1859, he was hanged before a military guard. Watching crowds saw not a villain, but a prophet die calmly. Within 2 years, the civil war he predicted had begun.
Brown's execution divided the nation. To the south, he was terror. To the north, sainthood. He proved that one determined man, standing alone against injustice, could push a country past the point of no return. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Post-World War II America feared one word: communism. When the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of expectation, the U.S. looked for traitors. Investigators followed a trail from Los Alamos through New York to a married couple, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They were ordinary Jewish New Yorkers, both left-leaning, with young children. Julius worked as an army engineer. Ethel's brother was a machinist linked to atomic research. Prosecutors claimed the pair ran a spy ring, passing atomic secrets to the USSR. The evidence was thin, based largely on coerced testimony, but the Cold War climate burned hot. Judge Irving Kaufman called their crime worse than murder. On June 19, 1953, at Sing Sing prison, they were executed by electrocution within minutes of each other, leaving their two sons orphans. Crowds outside sang and wept in equal measure. Declassified files later confirmed Julius had spied, but Ethel's role was likely minor or fabricated to pressure confession. Their case split America in half. Was it justice or political vengeance? 70 years later, the Rosenbergs remain a symbol of how fear can make any nation forget that law and truth should never burn in the same current.
Ken Saro Wiwa. By the 1990s, Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta should have been prosperous. Instead, villages in Ogoniland were suffocating under spills and gas flares from foreign companies and a military dictatorship that guarded them. Ken Saro Wiwa, writer, TV producer, and environmental activist, became the region's loudest voice. Through the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, he organized nonviolent protests demanding cleanup and a fair share of oil wealth. Crowds in the hundreds of thousands marched peacefully. The regime saw a threat to its profits. In 1994, Saro Wiwa was framed for the murder of 4 rival chiefs and tried in a kangaroo military court. Despite global outrage and appeals from the UN, he and 8 colleagues were hanged on November 10, 1995. His final words condemned corruption and pledged that the struggle would live on. It did. Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth, and Saro Wiwa became a martyr for eco-justice. Every oil spill photo and environmental protest in the Delta still speaks his name, a poet whose silencing gave his cause an unending echo.
Damiens de Saint-Victor. Once a minor poet and dreamer, Damiens de Saint-Victor drifted into madness and anger at the monarchy. In 1782, he attempted to attack Louis XVI with a small knife. The king was barely touched, but attempted regicide still carried the harshest sentence of the old code: execution by the wheel. In an age already whispering about reason and rights, crowds still gathered in Paris to watch limbs shattered with iron bars and body woven through a spinning wooden frame. It was a spectacle out of the Middle Ages, horrifying even the nobility. Within a few years, the Enlightenment finally won the argument. The guillotine was introduced as a humane modern alternative. So Damien stands as a grim historical bookend, the final public breaking wheel in France, the last time a country convinced of its civilization still shattered a man bone by bone in the square.
Ruth Ellis seemed born for it, until love turned violent. Her boyfriend, racing driver David Blakely, was abusive and faithless. One Easter afternoon, outside a pub in Hampstead, Ellis emptied a revolver into him and waited quietly for police. Her trial lasted barely a day. Obviously guilty was never in question. The real issue was mercy. Public sympathy rose when her bruises and mistreatment surfaced, but the law offered no leniency for crime of passion. On July 13, 1955, at Holloway Prison, Ellis became the last woman hanged in Britain. She was 28. The country reacted with shock, not satisfaction. Newspapers called it a hanging that hung Britain's conscience. 8 years later, the death penalty was abolished for murder. Ruth Ellis didn't just end a life, she ended an era.
Georges Danton. He helped start the French Revolution, and then it devoured him. Georges Danton was a thunderous orator. the voice that had sent the Paris mobs to storm the Tuileries and overthrow the monarchy in 1792. As the first Minister of Justice and founder of the Committee of Public Safety, he defended liberty with volcanic energy and the guillotine as its weapon. But revolutions have no brakes. When Danton began calling for moderation and an end to executions, his former ally Robespierre saw danger. Accused of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy, Danton refused to beg. "Show lie head to the people," he told the executioner. "It's worth seeing." On April 5, 1794, he and 14 companions met the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd, once his army, stood silent. 3 months later, Robespierre followed him to the same blade. Danton's death marked the revolution's turning point, proof that even its loudest heroes could be called traitor overnight. The man who cried liberty louder than anyone became the evidence that liberty, left unchecked, can consume its own children.